It's late July 1963. Bob Dylan's commercial and critical breakthrough, The Freewheeling Bob Dylan, is inspiring millions of listeners and has propelled him to worldwide acclaim. The Profumo affair continues to unravel, denting trust in Harold Macmillan's Conservative government. World heavyweight boxing champion Sonny Liston has retained his title in a rematch fight against former champion Floyd Patterson, who he had defeated 10 months earlier. And Lisa Kudrow, who had become the character Phoebe Buffay in the smash show Friends, is born. Meanwhile, the Beatles are a UK phenomenon, following the release of Please Please Me. But they have an appetite for more, knowing that their next album, which they've begun recording, could be make or break. This is UnBeatled, the show where each episode we delve deep into one song recorded by the Fab Four. We examine the history, writing, recording and impact of the song, while our resident musician David Bennett unpicks the lyrics and music. So please me and subscribe, like and comment to UnBeatled with David Bennett and Donnie Campbell on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we look at Paul's first great contribution to the band, All My Loving. So David, All My Loving, recorded in one day on the 30th of July 1963 before being released on With the Beatles a few months later. If you were a listener in 1963 and you put on With the Beatles, the record, in your living room, what is the first thing that you would say, I see what they've done there?
So the amazing thing about the early Beatles tracks is on face value, they sound quite similar to the artists who inspired the Beatles, like Little Richard, Elvis, Buddy Holly. But actually, when you look at the structure and the choices of chords, even from these earlier songs, they're quite unusual and quite unique. You know, the structure of this song, we have the sort of what you could call an A section. It's hard to even label any of this as verse and chorus because it's not really in that sort of structure. We have this A section with the... two of those in a row, and then we go to the B section, which you could call a middle eight. It could even feel like a chorus. You know, it's one of those songs where none of the sections have sort of obvious labels, but they're all connected really well. So, as I said, that A section begins with that descending note, 1, 2, 3. The next section begins with. So we have this sort of echo that they're both borrowing from the same motif. And I imagine Paul probably wasn't thinking, I'll recycle that motif. But that's the hallmark of a great writer, is he's using the same material and spinning it out to create something extra. So the B section is the... So we've had A section, B section, which is what we had there, the middle eight. Then a guitar solo, which has completely different chords. You know, they easily could have just had the guitar solo happen over the verse, over the A section, but they have another chord progression. Then we go A section, B section, B section, and within, less than 3 minutes, we're at the end of the song. So the structure never really repeats properly. It's all very novel all the way through, which is something you see a lot in Beatles songs. They're not lazy when it comes to structure. They make sure that every moment is giving us something a little bit different.
Which is interesting because they're not cutting corners, as you said. They're not being lazy. When it would have been so easy to, because at this time, it is sort of, let's call it first wave Beatlemania. They're big names in the UK. They're on tour constantly across 1963. They're on tour at the time of writing this song, when Paul writes it, they're on tour with Roy Orbison. They start as the support act and they end as the headliner because they were getting so popular. They're a big name in the UK, but they've not broken out of the country yet. They've not, US is still untouched completely. I think the rest of Europe is fairly untouched as well. But they're touring a lot. They're going through all those provincial towns, all the major cities. They're hitting them one by one and then hitting them again. They're on buses. They're in vans. They're on trains, and they're sort of. This is the beginning of their migration to London. They're spending lots and lots of time there. I think some of them have moved by this point or were beginning to move. They were looking for their first sort of homes outside of Liverpool and outside of their family house. So it's just this 6-month whirlwind from Please Please Me to the recording of this. It's been number one. It's riding high on the charts and it's all coming up Beatles, but in a very sort of low-key way. They probably still could walk about the streets, get something to eat, have a cup of coffee, have a drink without feeling too pestered. But it's really starting to build. We can feel this momentum going. And that's where the song originates from. Paul, while on the tour bus, thinks of this rhyme, this "close your eyes and I'll kiss you, tomorrow I'll miss you," and he's writing the words before he gets to the music, which is something that he'd never done before, and it's something he doesn't really do ever again. So it's one of the few Beatles songs for Paul that begins with the lyric, and he writes it while on tour with Roy Orbison, and it's well, it's an amalgamation of styles. It sounds a little bit country and western. It's a little bit Motown R&B girl group, and it's a little bit jazzy in a way. And can you explain sort of what Paul was sort of inhaling and then exhaling to sort of create All My Loving?
Yeah, so the Beatles often were bringing in all of these different influences into the melting pot, which is what gives their music such a unique identity. It's not just cliche rock and roll 50s 12-bar blues stuff. That's an ingredient, but it's not just that. So I definitely think with this song, jazz serves an influence. Paul McCartney's dad was a big jazzer. There was a lot of jazz in the house, and Paul definitely would have been absorbing some of that. And in fact, there's a moment in this song, in All My Loving, which note for note is very evocative of Kathy's Waltz by Dave Brubeck. It's the bit that goes, that's All My Loving, whereas Kathy's Waltz goes. So you have that same motif, the motif that begins the whole song, and as I mentioned a minute ago, also gives us the B section. That is from Kathy's Waltz, and whether Paul knew that or not, who knows, but that record almost definitely was playing in Paul's house when he was younger, so that is in there as an ingredient. And another thing hitting home that jazz influence is the walking bass line. Paul McCartney is famous for having very animated bass lines, very melodic bass lines, and of course, rock and roll, often had these sort of bass lines. You can imagine a rock and roll tune having a sort of like, or maybe a. So walking bass is part of rock and roll anyway, but rock and roll got walking bass lines from jazz. So here Paul is kind of pulling not just from rock and roll, but he's going back to the source and getting quite a jazzy style walking bass line. And what makes it jazzy is, unlike the classic rock and roll walking bass lines where they riff on a chord, so they kind of have a chord shape and they go, which is like what Paul did on Saw Her Standing There. On this one, it really walks. It really goes from the chord note that you're on and then walks down to the next one. So it really goes on that journey. So what we have is... And at that moment, as you can hear, it climbs all the way down the scale. So that is not something you would see in rock and roll. That is a jazz thing. So Paul is pulling from different worlds here, creating the unique flavour combination, which is the Beatles.
And while Paul on the bass is taken from jazz, the one thing that sticks out to me is John Lennon's rhythm guitar. It's the chicka 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 chicka, the sort of triplet sound. That's got to be taken from somewhere else. Yeah,
so that triplet swing, that dagga da dagga da dagga da dagga da, that that can come from swing, that can come from swingers in jazz, that can come from rock and roll, but also, as you mentioned, sort of like Motown acts. That constant, persistent dagga da dagga da dagga da dagga triplet sound is almost too triplety for your Elvises, your Little Richards. It was more that those sort of Phil Spector groups and the Motown groups, the Gale bands, would have those rhythms on them.
And can you tell us what else is happening in this song musically? Because other than that, the thing that also jumps out to me is the George Harrison guitar solo.
Yeah, so the guitar solo, as I say, goes over a completely different chord progression, which in fact kind of goes back to a more sort of classic blues chord progression. So whereas in this song we've had some quite unusual, or at least sort of original sounding chord progressions and a couple choices that are really quite unusual, which I'll look at in a second. In this guitar solo, it goes kind of back to basics, and we're in the key of E, and so it goes to an A chord, and then an E chord, and then a B7 chord, E. It's very classic blues flavors, but that gives us sort of a relief from what we've had in the rest of the song. So in the A section, we had this chord progression going F sharp, B, E, C sharp minor, A, F sharp minor, D, B. All kind of normal chords in isolation, but when stringed together like that, I would argue that there is not another song that's done that order of chords. And that's one of the beautiful things about the Beatles, is they took all of these inspirations, but they didn't just copy chord progressions from other artists. They often found new ways to put them together. And in the B section, we have this moment where we have the "Oh my loving," and the chords going C sharp minor, and then C augmented, and then E. Now, I doubt the Beatles knew what a C augmented chord was, but as you can kind of hear, it's just when you take the C sharp minor chord and lower the C sharp down to C. And if you lower that note again, you get E. So it's very intuitive. It's very kind of, okay, it's this chord, but let's change one note. And now let's change that note again. But you get this really slick, satisfying move with this very sophisticated augmented chord thrown in there, which is a chord the Beatles would often throw in to get that sort of unusual flavour.
Going back to that guitar solo, it is very country and western. So we've talked about jazz, we've talked about the sort of influence of those girl R&B groups, and then we've got another flavour. We've got this Carl Perkins, George Harrison guitar solo.
True, yeah. It really, they're not preoccupied with creating a particular type of music, a particular sound. They're just making music that they like the sound of, and combining all of their favourite flavours in there.
So this was recorded on the second day of tracking for With the Beatles, and they finished this track within an hour. From 10 p.m. to 11 p.m. was All My Loving, and by 11 p.m. they had the take they wanted.
Wow. Well, it's sort of, at that time, they were sort of just trying to bottle a live performance, and they were such a well rehearsed live unit that they could just go in there and get the take they want. This is way before the time. Well, I say way before. It's only a few years, but it feels eons away from Strawberry Fields Forever, where they're pouring over the same recording for hour upon hour. Here, they're just trying to bottle that live performance. But the interesting thing is that even back then, at the beginning of the Beatles' career, there were a few choices they would make that were very studio focused. So, for example, Paul's lead vocal is double tracked, meaning that it's the same performance twice, not just copied and pasted, but literally Paul would sing it and then he'd sing it again, and that kind of creates this lovely thick sound that I know Buddy Holly used to use, so maybe that was the inspiration for that sound. But also Paul recorded his own harmony vocal on here, so he's harmonizing with himself, which of course when they performed this live, then one of the other Beatles would have to take that line. But that's a very modern way to record, of just sort of, if you have an idea, recording it yourself, not considering getting the other guys involved and making it as a quote-unquote authentic thing where it's just a live performance bottled. Even in the early days here, you could feel the Beatles yearning to fully achieve that studio magic.
Yeah, it certainly is a Paul song. And to move on to the lyrics, they're very early Beatles in a way. Now, Paul, we know, was sort of courting Jane Asher at this moment in time, who would go on to become his girlfriend. He'd go on to live with her before breaking up and then him ending up with Linda. But it's certainly, he pours his heart and soul into it in a very romantic way. We know that the "I'll write home every day" line is a reference to the roadie Mal Evans, who promised his wife he would write home every day while they were out on the road, and being a song that was written while they were constantly touring. It showcases that time for the Beatles. It showcases what was happening in Paul's life. It's probably more autobiographical than we give it credit for. Being away from home for the first time for so long. And it's written in this letter format, which was popular at the time. They'd done "P.S. I Love You," and the Shirelles' "Soldier Boy" was a big influence on them, which was written as sort of to someone in this letter. And it was this time of unprecedented travel. They were flying, was becoming more common. International travel, highways, motorways weren't long a thing in the UK. It was the era of migration and travel within this generation of people that wanted to see more, that wanted to do more. The beatniks, the post-war generation. So it's evocative of that time. Although I'm not going to dwell too much on the words. As there's not too much to unpack, I would say, but it's just a lovely sentiment of I'll be back, almost Vera Lynn-esque. We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when.
True, and it is just to go back to what I was saying a moment ago. This era of the Beatles writing seems so sort of quaint and innocent compared to what happens just a mere few years later. It's easy to forget what a small period of time there was between this song and things like Strawberry Fields and Tomorrow Never Knows and all that stuff. This is almost just the prelude to what the Beatles would truly achieve. But you can already see that creativity there. They're not just writing generic pop songs. These are far from generic.
And pop song it is, and it's one of those songs that you listen to and you go, "Oh, that's a hit. That's a single." But it was never released as a single, never in the UK or never in the US. It was just released on the album With the Beatles in the UK and Meet the Beatles in the US. It was released on With the Beatles, which went straight to number one, became the second album ever to reach 1 million album sales in the UK. And this song was released as a single in Canada, where it became a number one hit. But so many Americans imported it from Canada that actually reached 45 on the Billboard Hot 100 in April 1964, which is a great fact. In terms of impact, I would say that this is one of Paul's first big songs. Sort of like one of his, putting his elbow out there, getting John off to the side a little bit and going, "I'm here as well." John is the leader at this moment in time in the band, but Paul is certainly showcasing his muscle.
Yeah. And the Beatles just had too many good songs. They had too many singles that you couldn't practically release them all as singles. Now in the post-physical music industry, every song can be a single, and it basically works that way. When Taylor Swift or Ed Sheeran releases an album, they all kind of enter the single charts, all 12 tracks on the album. But back then, due to the physical restraints of manufacturing, you had to choose a few to highlight. But actually, the Beatles had too many songs to highlight.
And this song, being the pop song that it was a mainstay of their live show for the next year, pretty much performed at every live performance they did. Most notably, it kicked off their performance on the Ed Sullivan Show in 1964. This was the first time America had really seen the Beatles. They had got the number one with "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and then they come on their big TV appearance on Ed Sullivan, hugely anticipated. Everyone sat down to watch it. 73 million people watch it, which was unprecedented at that time. It was a cultural watershed moment. And they kick off with "All My Loving," showcasing that they knew it was good.
And it's a fantastic opener because it begins with, there's no intro at all. So the vocal comes in before the first beat of the bar. It begins on the third beat before. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you're in. So Paul would always count it off as 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Close your eyes and I'll kiss you. So you're instantly in, and you just, the audience gets hit full throttle with the Beatles sound.
And this song made it. There was a great advert for their first album, Meet the Beatles, which was released on Capitol Records. So it's not their first album that was released in the US, but it was the first album that was released on Capitol Records in the US. And it made people flock to buy it. And yeah, John Lennon even said that it was all Paul, he regrets to say, as it's a damn good piece of work. So Paul is highlighting his writing prowess and becoming competitor to John in a way, and that battle for the lead single or the healthy competition would become, a huge part of the Beatles' drive to be the best, drive to do better, but also ultimately what probably dragged them apart in the way was the competitive nature of John, Paul, and then George.
Yeah, well, I think we can all agree that that both Paul and John were at their height of songwriting talent when they were together in the Beatles, although they wrote many fantastic songs afterwards in their solo careers. And that was, of course, that friendly competition. And I've always wondered, famously, every song that they did was accredited to Lennon and McCartney, regardless of whether the other was actually that involved. And what that means from a practical point is that the publishing, the money gets split 50-50. And what you see with bands that stick together, whether it's Coldplay or U2 or Radiohead, is they split the publishing equally, because then it is a friendly competition rather than a vicious fight for, I want my song on the album because then I get more money. So I think if the Beatles hadn't done that John Lennon and Paul McCartney 50-50 split from the very early days and honoured it all the way through, their career would have been even shorter than what we actually got, because the money would have become a real contentious point very quickly.
I've never even thought about that it would have been shorter. Yeah, I can totally see that as both of them butting heads, which they butted heads over money even when they were earning the 50-50 split.
Yeah.
And so you can only imagine what George felt like with his Only a Northern Song, his dig at his bosses in a way. Of John and Paul through them owning Northern Songs and his publishing. So All My Loving, not much more to say, but I just wanted to end on this poignant note that supposedly the song happened to be playing through the sound system in the emergency room at Roosevelt Hospital in Manhattan in New York when John Lennon was pronounced dead on December 8th, 1980.
It's chilling.
Yeah, a sort of chilling end to this. But thank you, David. This has been a great episode of UnBeatled. Do remember to like, subscribe, comment to get all the content you can want, all the Beatles content that we'll be throwing out there. So join us the next time we're out for Nowhere Man.